Hey everyone, and welcome. My name's Aaron. Today we are going to be talking about compression and compressors. What are they? What do they do? Why are they important to understand? Why are they so difficult to understand sometimes? I want to take you through some of the basics of what a compressor is, how to operate it, what are some of the controls, what do they mean, and then why it's important and why it's good to understand them and how you can get in there and start tinkering with them yourself. So what is a compressor? When we're talking about compressors, we're talking about dynamic range. What's dynamic range? Dynamic range is the range between the loudest sound in a given signal and the softest sound. The range between those sounds is called the dynamic range. Okay? So if you have a drum kit, for example, the loudest sound, maybe just the hardest hit of the snare drum, and then the softest sound, just the little twinkle on the cymbal. This is the dynamic range of that given drum kit. When we talk about compression, we're talking about limiting the amount of dynamic range. Now, we're not talking about turning something down. We're talking about limiting the space between the loudest sound and the softest sound. Aaron, why would we want to do that? Isn't dynamic range good? Isn't dynamic range what gives music its punch and clarity and power and stuff like that? Yes, that's true. And dynamic range is great, but especially when you're dealing with recorded music, you need to be able to manage dynamic range, because when people are listening to music, they don't have the tolerance for the huge amount of dynamic range and that are in most musical instruments and voices and things like that. And you don't want to be constantly turning up and turning down and turning up and turning down your volume. If you go and see an orchestra play live and you're in a concert hall, it's great because everyone's listening and paying attention and you have a huge amount of dynamic range. But in general, that's not the common musical listening experience. There's background noise and things like that. And people generally want to kind of set their music at a determined level and not have it totally destroy them when a big part comes in, and they don't want to have to turn it up when it gets really soft. So understanding compression is just a part of knowing how to record music well. So someone explained it to me this way, and I always remembered it, so I wanted to pass it on to you. If this is the loudest sound in your signal, so this is someone just screaming into their microphone, and this is the softest sound, just a little whisper into the microphone. Here, visually, is what a compressor does. Ready? Here we go. Okay? I'm going to do that again. Here's the loudest sound. Here's the softest sound. Here's what a compressor does. Okay? So it compressed the original signal and then brought up the overall level. And now our little dynamic range here is a much more manageable dynamic range. So when somebody whispers, I can hear them. And when they shout, I can hear them. I still have some dynamic range. I didn't do this. I still have some dynamic range, but I've limited the amount of dynamic range, and now I can kind of manage it and mix it and do all kinds of things with it. The key here is a good compressor will do this while maintaining a perceived larger dynamic range. So it will do this in a transparent and pleasing and beautiful and flattering kind of way. A lot of times when people come to me and they say, I don't understand compressors and can you give me some tips and whatever, it's because they're using a bad compressor. A lot of times, just unfortunately, that is our first exposure to compression, is using just the cheapest compressor that's around, just whatever's there. So it might be just some crappy old thing that's in the rack and you start turning knobs and you're like, it sounds bad. It's partially because you don't know how to use it, but it's also because that's probably a bad sounding compressor. I used to have a really hard time understanding compression, and I never really wanted to use them because they always just sounded worse when I turned one on. And then when I first started working in Nashville and I heard the sound of the 1176, Universal Audio, or before that Yuri 1176, I heard this on a vocal and my mind was just completely blown with how amazing it sounded. It just made it sound to me like something was at the far end of the room, and it just brought it right into my face. And I could hear every little throat thing that the singer was singing and all of the little intricacies. But then when they would sing out, it turned them down in this beautiful, like flattering sort of way. And once I heard that, I was like, I need to have one of those. And so eventually saved up and still have that one that I initially bought. They're like $2,000 or so and up if you buy like an old one, and there's all kinds of different versions. Not going to talk about that today. The point is, a good sounding limiter can really help whatever instrument is going into it just sound more present and more alive and just right there. I track like 99% of what I track through my 1176. It just makes it sound better. And it's one of those pieces of gear that even if you accidentally bump one of the knobs or your cat walks over it or something, it still sounds good. It's just such a musical, beautiful sounding piece of gear. Cannot recommend it highly enough. The 1176 has been copied, with guitar pedals, with plugins for good reason, because it just sounds so good. There's nothing like the real thing though. Get a real one. Save up. Mow some lawns, do some overtime. Yes, you can make things work with less, but it's much easier with good equipment. So what are the controls on a compressor? First of all, I want to talk about threshold or input. Threshold, if we're talking about dynamic range, the threshold is the point at which the compressor kicks in and starts working. It's basically a decibel level of input. So let's say we have our threshold set right in the middle of whatever this dynamic range is here. Anything below this threshold, the compressor's just leaving it alone. Anything above it, it is compressing. Some compressors, like the 1176, don't have a threshold control, but in essence, they have that with the input control. So on the 1176, you turn up the input control to drive the front end, to drive the input of the compressor. So it's going to compress more the more input you give it. Next controls, attack, release, and ratio. Attack is the amount of time it takes the compressor to start compressing after the signal crosses whatever threshold. So a very fast attack will squash even the quickest, input signals, like a snare drum, boom. It'll grab that and take it hostage. And sometimes you'll hear it kind of pumping and working and things like that. A very fast attack is a more dramatic effect when you're working with a compressor, which you might want, but that's what attack is. Release is the amount of time the compressor takes to let go, to stop working after the signal falls below the threshold. So that's the attack and the release. The ratio setting is the amount of input versus output once the signal crosses over the threshold. So my signal is coming in, somebody's whispering, they start to sing louder, now they're shouting or whatever, it's crossed the threshold. Now my compressor's grabbing it at the attack speed, and now it's compressing it at, let's say, a 4:1 ratio. What does that mean? That means basically for every 4 decibels of input, the compressor will put out 1 decibel of output. So it's a 4:1 ratio. You can go 8:1, 20:1, infinity to 1, some compressors have. So this is sort of the severity of how the compressor is working, is the ratio. On most compressors, you'll be able to visually see what the compressor is doing. The best thing to monitor is gain reduction. You want to see how much gain it is reducing. Basically, that's how hard the compressor is working, how much it is compressing the signal. And you'll see that meter jumping. It might be an LED, or on the 1176, it's a nice VU meter that's got a needle that jumps to the left when it's working really hard. Along with listening, you can kind of watch that meter to see how much your compressor is working. And then lastly, there's output or output gain. That is this step in the process. So I've compressed my signal, and now I want to bring everything up so that it's at a good level to Pro Tools or to my front of house or wherever you might be. So those are the basic controls of operating a compressor. Now I want to play some instruments and stuff and show you the difference between something that's just dry and uncompressed versus hitting it with the 1176, and you'll be able to kind of hear the difference in the sounds. So the human voice is actually one of the most dynamic instruments that you can record. So it's really important to understand what compression is doing to a vocal and what you can do to really help limit that dynamic range when you're recording. So I want to show you and exaggerate a little bit a huge sort of dynamic range, and then show you the difference with a compressor and without. So in a minute, I'm going to switch over to this microphone and you'll hear it first without any compression. All right, here it is, talking into the Sound Deluxe U195, kind of a normal volume. If someone was singing and they were kind of chilled out, this is about how loud they'd be singing. And then if they got really quiet, here's what it would be like if they were just whispering or just barely singing at all. Some of those really intricate, beautiful moments. And then if they got a little bit louder, it would sound like this. And then if they got really excited, it probably distorted, and you could probably hear that. And you've probably come up against that problem before when you're recording, that I don't know where to set the level because it's too low, and then when they sing really loud, it's too high. Compressor. Well, compressor to the rescue. All right, and now we've got the 1176 engaged, and I can talk at a normal volume, and here's kind of how it sounds. If I go down to a whisper, it predictably will be bringing up the sound of the whisper because it's limiting my dynamic range and bringing everything up. And then when I start to talk a little bit more loudly, and even if I shout, I'm still not clipping, and it actually sounds okay. You probably couldn't see, but the meter was really moving back there, and you could probably tell the sound between the two, how this just brings it right into your face and just keeps it there. And I can just whisper in your ear, whisper sweet nothings. Got a little toy piano here. This is kind of a percussive, very percussive instrument, and this will be a good example of kind of how the compressor will bring, kill the attack a little bit and then bring out the decay of a given instrument. So hopefully you could hear through those examples what the compressor is doing. You may have heard it even bring up the noise floor. That's something a compressor does because it's compressing and bringing up all of those soft sounds, including the background noise in the room. So that's kind of one of the trade-offs of using a compressor, is you got to be in a quiet room, and you might all of a sudden notice that your room sounds really horrible once you start using a compressor. So that's it for today. Hopefully that was helpful. We'll see you guys next time.